Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our guests from around the planet who've tuned in for this incredible program that we're doing this evening here at Global Minnesota. Tonight is one of our public programs, and we're able to provide these free of charge to the entire planet because of the generosity of our sponsors, our members, and especially all of our individual supporters out there who are part of our community, who have seen the purpose and the vision of Global Minnesota for now 70 years and make these kinds of public affair programs available to everyone on the planet now, thanks to Zoom, at no charge. My name is Mark Ritchie, and I have the honor of serving as president of Global Minnesota. We connect Minnesotans to the world and the world to Minnesota, and we'll be doing that tonight with this program about a new amazing book that we want to urge you to buy and read. But tonight we'll be talking to the two authors, The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III. This evening's program is presented in partnership with the Committee on Foreign Relations, the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota, and the World Affairs Council of America. I want to introduce one of our partners who will be helping us with this evening's program. But first, I want to remind you that questions for our discussion, for our panel and presenters, can be sent by way of email, just questions with an S at globalminnesota.org. There's a little description box there at the YouTube to see that. So again, it's questions with an S at globalminnesota.org. Mary Curtin is our partner. We work with her a lot at the Humphrey School, where I'm also a graduate, but she's the resident, the diplomat in resident, and has been at the Humphrey School since 2013, following a 25-year career in America's Foreign Service, where she served all over the world as one of our State Department's Foreign Service officers. In that tour of duty for 25 years, she served pretty much on all continents, but she also was a U.S. delegate to the 1995 UN Conference on Women. Our university and our state are very glad to have this native of Minnesota back as diplomat in residence at the Humphrey School. And I want to welcome you, Mary Curtin, and turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you, Mark, for that introduction. And on behalf of Dean Laura Bloomberg, I'd like to welcome all of you to this incredibly timely event about James Baker, the man who ran Washington, which the Humphrey School of Public Affairs is proud to sponsor in partnership with Global Minnesota and the World Affairs Councils of America. One of my deep regrets of this coronavirus season and the restrictions is that we can't host this kind of exciting event in person at our Humphrey School Conference Center. We always really enjoy partnering with Global Minnesota on those events and bringing together our students, our academic community, and the community across the Twin Cities to discuss important global issues. But I'm looking forward to a time when we can do that again. This event is particularly exciting for me because I first encountered James Baker as a very junior Foreign Service officer on the Egypt desk when he became Secretary of State. And I was able to see up close his deep engagement in policy and his outreach to Foreign Service officers like my boss at the time, whom he personally reached out to for her insights into Egypt policy issues. Many years later, when I was political counselor in Warsaw, I welcomed him to Poland when he headed a delegation to the 25th anniversary celebrations of the Solidarity Union, and I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time talking to him about all kinds of policy issues. So it's an honor for me to introduce the authors of this new biography, who I think actually need little introduction, but they are Peter Baker, who is the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, a political analyst for MSNBC, and author of Days of Fire and The Breach. And Susan Glasser, who is a staff writer for The New Yorker and author of its weekly Letter from Trump's Washington, as well as a CNN global affairs analyst. Their first assignment as a married couple was as Moscow bureau chiefs for the Washington Post, after which they wrote the book Kremlin Rising. Today they live in Washington, D.C. with their son. And our moderator for tonight is Bill Clifford, who's the president and CEO of the World Affairs Councils of America in Washington, D.C., where he leads WACA's national office and represents its nonpartisan nonprofit network of more than 90 World Affairs Councils across the United States, of which Global Minnesota is one. And so without much further ado, I'd like to turn the evening over to our moderator, Bill Clifford, and to welcome Peter Baker and Susan Glasser virtually to Minnesota, where it's also been beautiful weather until today, but I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, for the introduction. And thanks to the Humphrey School and especially to my colleagues, Mark Ritchie and everyone at the Global Minnesota team. Welcome to this program, wherever you are in the country or the world. And hello to you, Peter and Susan. It's great to see you tonight. I'm in Washington, D.C. myself, and you've been great friends of the World Affairs Council's network over the years for book talks and other programs that you've done around the country and at our WACA National Conference over time. So welcome to you both.
Well, thank you, Bill. Thank you so much. And thank you to Mary and Mark. We're so thrilled to be here. We wish we were in Minnesota, actually, because we love Minnesota. It's a great state. But if we can't be there in person, this is the next best thing.
Well, great. You are the authors of a fantastic and well-timed new book. James A. Baker III is The Man Who Ran Washington, and actually at a time when Washington ran the world. I wonder, have you spoken with Secretary Baker since the election?
Well, in fact, we did.
Actually, yeah.
We called him last week because Jared Kushner was going around telling people he wanted a James Baker-like figure to run their recount or election challenge issues. And so we decided we would call the real James Baker to see what he thinks. And he didn't think much of it. I think he made the point that the Florida recount, which everybody remembers he was famously involved in with George W. Bush, was very different than this. So it was good to talk to him and hear a little bit about his views of it.
He declined, but, and he didn't, of course, endorse Trump as a candidate either time. But he did at least vote for him the first time. And do you have a sense whether he cast his ballot for President Trump this time?
You know, I think he did follow through on that. And, you know, his is a story about the Republican Party and how far it's come in many ways from the Republican Party that Baker spent so much of his career building up. And, you know, a lot of people were very surprised when we reported that in our book that, you know, he was essentially thinking of doing this, even though he, in so many ways, was the un-Trump, both in terms of substantively, he remains an internationalist, a free trader, a believer that personal integrity matters, also sort of offended at the sort of incompetence and disarray of the Trump White House. But at the same time, this is a much more partisan moment than the politics when Baker was sort of ruling things. Even though there were bitter fights in the 1980s and 1990s, this kind of extreme tribalization and polarization really didn't exist. And Baker thrived in Washington actually by being a very different kind of Republican than the Republicans we see today. It's not his personal inclination. That's what makes it hard to square. He wouldn't be a believer in the burn it down politics that we're seeing. And in fact, that we saw today with Mitch McConnell refusing to accept the legitimacy of election while claiming victory among Republicans in the Senate and the House for the exact same ballots that they refused to accept at the presidential level. That's not Jim Baker's style of politics. And it tells you a lot about our country right now that he would vote for somebody given how he thinks about them.
It's an incredible time. And I just want to push a little bit more on this because you have someone like Michael Steele, who was former head of the Republican National Committee, who would say, I'm a conservative, I'm a would-be Republican again, but I'm not a Trumpist. That is not conservatism. That is not the GOP that I or we know. So I wonder why Baker retains such a party man inclination, especially in light of the fact that the Bushes all came out and some of his other friends in the party said, Jim, you're going to ruin your reputation over this, or they criticized him for it.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. We started this book 7 years ago, back in the dim recesses of the Obama era. So it wasn't really about him and Baker, him and Trump at first, but over the rise of Trump, we would have these regular conversations with him going back now 4 or 5 years. And we watched him struggle with this. We watched him wrestle with this out loud. And he told us he thought Trump was crazy and he thought he was nuts and he didn't think much of him. And yet he kept going back and forth on whether he could support him. But, at one point we had lunch with him in DC about a year ago. He says, yeah, I think I could vote for Biden. He's the kind of Democrat I could vote for. And then about 2 months later, he says, well, don't tell people I'm going to vote for Biden because I can't leave my party, even though my party has left me. That's the way he put it. My party has left me. And so in Baker's mind, I think his compromise was that, which is he's not going to endorse Trump. He doesn't do anything for him. He wouldn't respond to any requests for help. But in the privacy of the voting booth, he still voted for him. And I think it tells you something about the nature of Baker's view of power, which is that you have none if you're on the outside of the tent throwing bricks on the inside. So just instinctively, his nature is not to be a rebel, but to be somebody on the inside trying to steer things, even in a situation where they can't really be steered.
Now, it's interesting that he really had no inclination or desire to become a politician for much of his early adult life. And in fact, his family lineage, he had patriarchs who flatly pushed him away, as you described. I'm wondering if you could share with us how important the friendship with George H.W. Bush was, and really that friendship, that arc of that friendship covered not only his entry into politics, but as you say, on the other end with George W. Bush, 41's son, at the time of the 2000 election.
Look, there's no question this was a unique relationship in modern American politics, or even arguably in American politics, period, going all the way back to have a president and ultimately a Secretary of State who were that close is really, we argue whether maybe Jefferson and Madison might have, fit that bill or not. I think the consensus is no, in the sense that Madison really wasn't that much of a peer of Jefferson's, more of an acolyte. Whereas Baker and Bush were almost symbiotic. Initially when they met each other, in Houston, on the tennis courts of the Houston Country Club, they were doubles partners, fiercely competitive doubles partners, who won not one, but 2 club championships, as they both would tell you later in life. Bush was actually kind of the elder brother in their initial relationship. Baker described him to us at one point as dazzling at that point. We forget because we know that George, Herbert Walker Bush of later, kind of dorky older Bush. But, he was a war hero. He was a pretty dazzling figure. He had been the youngest naval aviator, one of them, in World War II. Baker was a little bit younger, had not been in World War II. Bush had broken away from his very patriarchal family. His father was the senator from Connecticut, Prescott Bush, very regal. He insisted that his own children call him senator at the dinner table, whereas Baker was still in Houston, which was where he was actually the 4th generation, even though his name is the 3rd. He was the 4th generation of James Addison Bakers, and living very much in the shadow. His father, grandfather, and great-grandfather before him had been, leading lawyers, corporate lawyers in Houston. They helped to found the firm Baker Botts, which at one time was the largest law firm west of the Mississippi. They had a family rule to stay out of politics ever since great-grandfather Baker had been an elected judge briefly in the Confederacy during the Civil War. That didn't work out so well, and ever forward, they saw politics as a dirty business that they shouldn't be involved with. And so I think, again, it's this amazing story. Baker never would have been in politics if it weren't for Bush, but arguably Bush might never have become president if it weren't for Jim Baker. It's an incredible story.
Yeah. I want to say that it struck me in reading about the entry into Washington when he was in his mid-40s, and Bush from China, when he had been ambassador, was trying to help him get jobs. And it struck me that for all his incredible skills and talents, Jim Baker was also quite lucky at a number of moments.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, especially early on, he had a meteoric rise, and his luck included, you know, when he was at Commerce Department, which people may not remember, that Elliot Richardson, who was going to be his boss, did not come from London. And then by happenstance almost, he was on the plane with Gerald Ford, you know, campaigning because the delegate hunter that he would become, Jim Baker would become, had died in a car crash. And more events like that just put him in the place, and he took full advantage. But
Yeah,
a lucky guy.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it tells you a lot about how history is dependent, not just on the larger forces that we talk about, and rightly so, but also on sort of accidental, you know, happenstances. And in this case, as you say, this is an accidental indispensable man. He wasn't really going to head in the direction he was, but for all these sequence of events you just sort of mentioned. And I think that that's one of the things that makes the story so compelling, right? This guy's not born to be Secretary of State. It happened to him, and he showed through his talent when the opportunities arose that he could rise to the occasion, but the opportunities had to be there as well. And it was partly because, as you say, he happened to be with Ford when Ford's delegate hunter is killed in a car accident, or the whole Watergate generation of Republican operatives had been wiped out. And so there was room for new guys like a Jim Baker to come along in. And I think that one of the things that makes the story really interesting.
Or even later in, you know, the second Reagan administration, when Don Regan approaches him to switch jobs.
That's right.
And he's not involved in any of the Iran-Contra mess or having to deal with it. And as, you know, Bush 41's Secretary of State, you know, the whole world is changing around him. So, but he made everything count. I wonder if you could, I mean, for all the positions he held, Chief of Staff for 4 years, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of State, and all the many campaigns that he ran for the Republicans, which of those positions do you think he was most effective at?
You know, it's interesting. It speaks to Baker's skills that he is considered to be a gold standard when it comes to being White House Chief of Staff. Democrats and Republicans would say that he was probably the best one ever to have had the job. But you can look at his tenure as Secretary of State and say that arguably it was the most consequential since the immediate aftermath of the World War II period. And I'm saying that knowing that we can have a conversation about Kissinger, but you know, certainly it was no small potatoes. And then the fact that he ran 5 presidential campaigns suggests obviously that he was pretty good at being a national campaign manager. My own take is that probably White House Chief of Staff was where he did the job in a way that far outshined anyone who had it before or since. But of course, what he'd like to be remembered most for was for having been Secretary of State when the Cold War ended.
Of course. Peter, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. I think you could make the case that he was perhaps the most consequential Secretary of State as well, because even though in the post-Cold War, in the post-World War II era, and I think that's not just because he was great Chief of Staff, but also I think he outshined Kissinger in some ways. Kissinger opened up to China. That was a big deal. But Baker managed the world when the world has changed, right? Fall of the Berlin Wall, which was 31 years ago today, the reunification of Germany that followed, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War. It didn't have to happen peacefully. It didn't have to happen in a way that it did, that would work so well for the West. And I think that Baker's skill, he didn't make these things happen necessarily, but his skill in managing them makes him, stand out in the annals of history.
So I'm going to differ. And it's the one position that neither of you mentioned. And I think actually, of course, he was a great Secretary of State, but I think his real advantage, I mean, among, again, all the things that he brought to it, he had that tight relationship with George Bush. And it sort of leaves Bush out of the picture out of all those events, but Bush and also an incredible team that we haven't seen since, which is Cheney at Defense, Colin Powell, and of course Brent Scowcroft at the NSC. So that team was also amazing. But
Totally.
I'd say Secretary of Treasury, he got a generational tax reform done. He did the Plaza and Louvre Accords on the international currency, which never had finance ministers come together to coordinate like that. He got the Canada Free Trade Agreement done at a severe deadline. And perhaps most consequentially for the country, he installed Alan Greenspan. He engineered it. He engineered Reagan's installation of Greenspan. And that pick really governed our economy for 20 years.
Yeah. No, I think you've got a good point there.
What's amazing about that, by the way, is that Baker was truly, as you mentioned, an accidental Secretary of the Treasury. Had he not gone over to Don Regan's office and had lunch with Don Regan at that exact moment, and Regan was actually mad at him because of a leak from the White House.
Right.
And actually the lunch was not to discuss swapping jobs. The lunch was to, complain to Baker about his stewardship of the White House. And so, not only was that just sort of a random moment that exactly happened right after, the 1984 election, and they were both casting about for something new to do. But, Jim Baker on paper was one of the least prepared Treasury secretaries ever. He had an economics course as an undergraduate at Princeton and probably didn't do all too well in it. And that's about it. He had no finance background, had no international economic experience. And it's kind of an amazing story. What he brought, of course, was understanding of Congress at that moment in time, probably better than anyone else in the Reagan administration, and an ability, his natural negotiating skills that had been honed in the previous 4 years of internecine warfare in the Reagan White House.
He really had more trouble with Republicans around that tax debate than he did with Democrats like Dan Rostenkowski. That bipartisanship ship is long gone from Washington today. And I wonder if you think that there's a prospect with Joe Biden to bring some of that back.
Well, I would say Joe Biden would like to be a Baker-like Democrat, right? In other words, he would like to be a deal maker. I think it's his nature, his instinct. He's of the same, more or less, generations, younger obviously, but from the same time period in some ways. Baker and Biden worked together back in the day. And I think that, Biden's history is to work with Mitch McConnell and other Republicans. I don't know that the opportunities are going to be available to him in the same way that they were to Baker at that moment, right? Baker could sit down with Dan Rostenkowski, and Dan Rostenkowski could go on national television and say, hey, we're willing to work with Ronald Reagan and Jim Baker to redo the tax code. And it's hard to see Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell saying, hey, we'd like to work with Joe Biden to redo something.
Well, since they won't even accept his election. I think it's fair to say that when you won't even accept someone's election, it's very hard to envision bipartisan deals coming out of these folks.
Maybe they'll accept it after Georgia's Senate runoffs, but really, I almost think, if Jim Baker were, running Washington today, he'd come in and Biden's got the right approach. I mean, he announced a task force today of 13 scientists and medical experts to take on COVID. And really, that is the business right now. That is today's tax reform. It's got to be all in. And
well, it's hard to imagine this COVID relief bill, which has been sitting out there since April, not passed. It's hard to imagine Jim Baker not finding a deal there. In fact, this is the easiest thing in the world to do. Government officials and politicians like to give away money. That's the easiest thing they do. And they haven't been able to come up with a deal simply to do that. Baker would never have allowed that to happen.
Well, what's interesting, though, is that it suggests the structural shifts are not just with an executive branch that's not competent or that's not willing to make a deal, but in the COVID thing, in fact, suggests how hard it will be for Biden. Because in the end, ultimately, it actually was McConnell and the Senate Republicans who refused to go along with the deal. And, you had the Treasury Secretary, feckless, Steve Mnuchin, not really empowered by Trump on the one hand. On the other hand, it might have been easier to get Trump to do that deal if he thought it might, certainly if he thought it might boost his reelection. But he was facing Senate Republicans who were even more intransigent. So I think that does not bode well. Now, again, I generally agree with Peter that Baker has, was willing to go after the hard deal in ways that actually made it happen. And certainly you look at, we're talking today is the incredible anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Unification was, seems a lot more inevitable in hindsight than it did at the time. And so I don't rule out that, having an exceptional character here could lead us to better and different results than the ones we're getting right now. But the structural shifts are so profound, unfortunately, in Washington today.
That's a very good point about what you just said, Susan, about solving these problems in real time with things that will come into their inbox from everywhere as well. You just cannot really hold that flow down amid all the bureaucratic infighting within the West Wing and between Congress and the agencies. One thing that impressed me, I didn't realize the arc of this issue. I actually was a young Hill staffer in the mid 80s, and sort of, I guess my impression, and not on that side, but I guess the impression was, wow, they are incredibly disciplined. Actually, there was a lot of infighting in the White House, but their messaging was disciplined. And to take one example where it's clear from your book that Baker was fighting for some time, he was really vexed by the conservatives, the purist ideological wing of the Reaganites that didn't trust him. And he always thought they were going to mess up the Contras issue in Nicaragua. And that was while he was chief of staff. And then when he becomes Secretary of State, it's the first issue he wants to get done. He sort of very methodically looks at things, I think, and says, this may be hard, but this is a building block. We're going to do it. He saw bipartisan opportunity in Congress, right after Bush was elected. And they took the Contras, he didn't call them freedom fighters, they took it off the table. And that positioned him with an early win to build on these other things that were coming at him with the Soviet Union, the Gulf War, and so forth.
Yeah, Bill, I think it's exactly right. He saw early on that if he was going to get anything accomplished on the big stuff, he had to make the distraction go away. And the distraction at that point was Central America, because they were never going to win there. They were never going to succeed in the way that they had hoped to. He always saw that as a misadventure. Michael Deaver tells a story about the first days of the Reagan White House, and Baker sits down with him, and he says they're sitting so close their knees were almost touching. And Baker says to him, your job and my job is to keep these crazies over there from getting us into a war in Central America. So he was always very wary of that. And you're right. So a month after the 1988 election, where he just eviscerated Michael Dukakis, not a softie by any stretch, Baker is in the apartment of Bob Strauss, the former chairman of the Democratic National Committee, having dinner with Jim Wright, the Speaker of the House, Democrat, to say, how can we make this Contra War thing go away? And he works with Jim Wright and Chris Dodd and Jimmy Carter to basically find a way to get it off the table. And it works. And therefore he can focus on Germany, and he focus on Soviet Union and the Middle East when that comes up, because he does want to focus on issues that are hard but doable, not impossible, and not too easy that he can leave to other people.
That's really a great point too, that I'd forgotten that he had reached out to Jimmy Carter when nobody in the Reagan or Bush teams were thinking of doing that, and knew that Carter had these contacts. And
he
could
told us
leverage them.
that may be the only Republican who likes Jimmy Carter, but he did. He liked Jimmy Carter.
Right. Let's talk about some personalities. The women. One of the keys was clearly Nancy Reagan, who said, her worst decision was to sort of tell Ronnie that Baker for Don Regan's job swap was a good idea. But he really, especially in contrast to how Don Regan handled Nancy Reagan, that was critical to Baker's success.
Look, Jim Baker was brilliant at mapping out power and understanding it in all of the institutions, that he entered in his life. And he quickly understood that Nancy Reagan was the crucial factor in the Reagan White House. And, he's no dummy. There's no way that he was going to be alienating Nancy Reagan. And in fact, there was this famous troika that was essentially running things in the beginning of Reagan's presidency. And Baker understood, like, if there's going to be a threesome here, I'm going to be on the side of the two and not on the side of the one. And the other person who was on the side of the two was Michael Deaver, who was very close to the Reagans personally, to Nancy Reagan. Nancy Reagan liked Baker from the beginning. She was always a little wary of him. Of course, she was very focused on loyalty, and Baker was an outsider to the Reagan inner circle, right? He came from Bush world. He had run not one, but two national campaigns against Ronald Reagan. But at the same time, I think she instinctively, he fit her definition of what the role required. He was very attentive and courteous to her. He understood that part of his job was to serve her as well as Reagan. And so, for example, he knew about Nancy Reagan's White House astrologer. And I just love this story. Margaret Tutwiler is one of Baker's closest advisors. And she is horrified when she hears about this for the first time. And she goes to Baker and she says, "You knew about this? You knew about this?" And he just throws up his hands and he says, "Go talk to so-and-so about it." He knew about it. He didn't want to, cross Nancy Reagan, even if it seemed absurd to him.
I mean, that guided things like when presidential debates would happen on a certain day.
That's exactly right. It was some, super, maybe not like Trump era level crazy stuff, but pretty crazy stuff. And it says a lot, by the way, that, when Nancy Reagan passed away a few years ago, she wanted Jim Baker to deliver the eulogy at her funeral.
Indeed. Another woman who also was close, but there were moments when she felt that Jim was thinking more about Jim than her husband, was Barbara Bush. What do you think about that relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, Barbara Bush loved Jim Baker. He was her husband's best friend, but there were these moments of friction. And one of them came, for instance, the 1992 campaign. Baker was Secretary of State. He didn't want to go back to the White House to help salvage this flagging re-election campaign that Bush was running, but he gets pushed into it, in effect. And he does. And he's not especially excited about it. And some people thought he wasn't really giving it his all. He made the campaign better, but they thought he wasn't fully engaged as he should have been. In fact, and one of the people who thought that was Barbara Bush. She called him the invisible man. Why aren't you out there defending? Why aren't you out there doing more for my husband? Now, he sat down with her and George at one point, and George says to Barbara, "Now knock it off. Jimmy did what he could." But it was this moment of real friction there. And it took a few years, I think, for that to kind of fade. But even in late life, just a couple of years ago, she was giving an interview to one of our journalistic colleagues, Susan Page, who wrote a biography of her. Mm-hmm. And they were talking about the 1980 campaign when Baker pushes Bush to get out so he could preserve his viability as possibly getting Reagan's vice presidential nod. Mm-hmm. And Susan Page says to Barbara Bush, "Well, I think that he wanted to, make sure that to preserve your husband's ability to be vice president." And Barbara Bush kind of tartly says he wanted to be chief of staff. So she even then was seeing him as sort of looking out for himself rather than for Bush. So that was always there under the surface.
Right. I know that the folks at Global Minnesota are all interested in foreign policy and that kind of thing, and we will get there. I want to remind them that, or anybody in the audience, that if you want to ask questions of Peter Baker and Susan Glasser, the authors of The Man Who Ran Washington, you can write them in the chat box, or you write them to questions with an S at globalminnesota.org. The last, not necessarily the last, but a third woman I would like to talk about, because when you think about Jim Baker, you think about the public persona, you think about his accomplishments, his resume, and what he did remarkably over this period of the 70s to the 90s. He was married twice, and one of the most poignant parts of your book was the tragedy of his first wife, Mary Stuart McHenry, who died of breast cancer, and which kind of allowed the transition in Jim Baker's life professionally in some ways. But that was just an amazing segment of your book, and his second wife, Susan. He he had, we'll talk about him as a husband and as a father and some of the things that he went through and that they went through.
You know, it really, Peter and I did not know much about, the personal life of Jim Baker when we embarked on this project. And there's no question that part of the story, not only his own family's, history, I mentioned a bit of it in Houston, they really were almost like, founders of the city in many ways and many of its key institutions. But it was a life of great privilege, but also a constrained life of obligation and duty, a very narrow world in some ways. Baker was much more under the sway of his father, who was a very micromanaging sort, well into adulthood. He married Mary Stewart, his college love affair that he met on the beach on spring break when he was in college. And, they married young, as people did at that time. They had 4 young sons. I think it was a very traditional life that Baker was living in every possible way. His wife was clearly very smart, but, was devoted to having these 4 sons. Baker was a workaholic, like his father, and was often, worked every weekend as well as during the week. I don't think he was maybe quite as strict with his boys, but he definitely was just a traditional character. He went hunting on the weekends. Barbara Bush used to joke that he, was not voting because election day was the same time as the opening of hunting season. He claims that's not true, but at any rate, he was just absolutely a traditional guy. And then this tragedy strikes, and his wife is diagnosed still in her 30s with cancer. And, we found this letter that's published in the book, and it's to his best friend, George Herbert Walker Bush. And he says, Mary Stewart is not going to get better from her cancer. The doctors told me that this is a fatal diagnosis. I have not told her. I have not told anyone. I have not told my mother. I have not told our sons. A terrible mistake, of course, I should say as an aside. And, actually Barbara Bush later said to Peter when he interviewed her for this book that, Jimmy knew it was a mistake and he shouldn't have done that. But he confesses this to Bush. That's obviously answers one question we had going into the book. How close were they really? The answer is they were that close. Sharing a secret like that
was foundational to the friendship.
Exactly. That's not some country club, have a few drinks on Saturday, after playing a tennis match kind of friendship. This is something profound. And it also is relevant that it was in the context even then of politics. Baker was already growing dissatisfied and restless with his corporate law practice in Houston. It wasn't how he wanted to spend his life. He wasn't yet ready to break away. Bush at this time was planning to run for Senate, and he thought that his friend Jim Baker would be a great successor to him in the U.S. House of Representatives. Baker was actually flirting with this and was quite interested. And so the letter was to tell George, there's no way I can't do this. And to me, that tells you an awful lot, obviously, about the very stultified gender roles at the time. In hindsight, like that can seem crazy to us, but also about the nature of this very close human bond that he had with George Bush. And
when he married again, it was actually Mary Stewart's close friend, Susan. And I'm blanking on her other names, but she was remarkable in a way that just withstanding his life.
Exactly.
They had between them 7 children, and then their first child came along as well. So 8 in all. She was managing 8 kids, and I just can't imagine that happening today. You guys have 1 child, by the way. And speaking of can't imagine, you're both working for premier media organizations. You also serve television at night, and you have a child, and you're writing a 600-something page book. So how do you do it? And how do you divide the labor of never mind, we'll get to your son, Theo, who you dedicate the book to, but you were both in Moscow together. Did you both write the same chapter on Baker and Shevardnadze, or how did you work this book out over these 7 years in your family?
Yeah, it's a great question. We could use a Susan Baker of our own, actually.
Yeah,
We only
she
have one
really
kid.
was amazing. She had
Yeah.
4 children in middle school at the same time,
Yeah.
all in different schools.
And when she discovered that Baker, her husband, was about to be chief of staff at the Reagan victory party on the night of the election in 1980, she burst out into tears. But and Reagan tried to reassure her. Reagan says, "Don't worry, I'm going to get him home by 5 o'clock every day." And she said, "Sure you are, Mr. President." And every time he would see her in the next couple of years, he would ask her, "Susan, is your husband getting home by 5 o'clock?" "Well, no, sir, Mr. President, he's not." But she eventually gave him a dispensation. We got along. We did this because the truth is, we met in a newsroom. This is how we started our relationship. She was an editor at the Washington Post. I was a reporter at the Washington Post. We worked together on the Clinton impeachment. That was the first big story we did together in that sense. And then we went to Moscow, as was mentioned earlier, as reporters and wrote a book together. So we have been for 20 years now, professional as well as personal partners. And that has really, for us, that's at the heart of our relationship. So for us, writing it together is a great treat. Now, each project can be different. One project you trade off chapters, another project you trade off the drafts and one writes, the other writes through, or what have you. It kind of depends on the kind of book you're writing. We're about to start another book in which I think the division of labor is Susan does all the work and I will be happy to sit and eat bonbons while she does it.
I don't think she'll allow you that.
But it really kind of depends on the type of project. We have our offices sit right next to each other. We're back and forth all day, every day, especially during the COVID, obviously, has been a great, one of the benefits of this terrible time is that we get to work even more closely together than usual.
Wonderful. We've got about 15 minutes left, and I'd like to again call to the folks at Global Minnesota to send your questions in. I'm curious about the kind of team you think Biden will bring in the foreign policy realm. Are there any people that you see likely to be tapped in that regard? And what do you see? How do you think Joe Biden and that team will go about prioritizing America's place in the world?
Well, it's a good question. Obviously, I must admit, like up until 2 days ago, I would have said I refuse to answer this question. I generally believing that you cannot, read a lot of stories about the future cabinet before the election takes place, especially because then the politics happen and the politics look a little bit different of what that cabinet is going to be like now than they did a week ago. But that being said, look, Joe Biden is super experienced on the foreign policy side in particular. He was not only vice president for 8 years under Obama, but chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee before that, and has a deep bench of talent who worked very closely with him in all of those roles, as well as a deep, Rolodex and actual relationships with world leaders. So, I think expect he'll be quite hands-on when it comes to foreign policy and national security. A lot of the people, are people we've known forever. Tony Blinken, who was his closest advisor on this, both during the Obama administration and then on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, started working on the National Security Council during the Clinton era. He's going to play a key role, I'm sure, whether it's national security advisor or something else, remains to be seen. Susan Rice obviously was even, reportedly a finalist for vice president. It'll be interesting whether they pursue appointing her as Secretary of State, given the new reality of a very intransigent Senate. She was perceived as not confirmable in that position in the Obama era, which is why John Kerry ended up as Secretary of State, because Susan Rice in the post-Benghazi political environment was seen as not confirmable. I don't know whether Biden will just go ahead and try it anyways, but she could have a key role. Samantha Power, who was the UN ambassador, could have a key role. Michelle Flournoy, I think, seems to be the odds-on favorite to be the defense secretary after having played an important role as the head of policy at the Pentagon in the beginning of the Obama administration. So, this is an incredibly deep bench of people who have real experience. And of course, then you have some of the younger people from the Obama administration who might be ready to take more senior roles. Their problem is not going to be lack of good people or lack of, willingness to serve. It's going to be the fact that there's a world on fire. Biden has said he'll rejoin the Paris Accord on day one. He'll rejoin the World Health Organization on day one. I think that the challenge of making and distributing a coronavirus vaccine, if, knock wood, that is in case actually what we're dealing with in January, will be maybe an early way for him to sort of put some points back on the board for the US globally and show that we are interested in playing a leadership role after 4 years when it wasn't clear that that was the case. But obviously, Europe, look at Chancellor Merkel's statement today. People are very happy and welcoming America back to the world and things like that.
Many countries. I have questions piling up, so I want to get to them, but I just do want to do a little counterfactual, and who can, whatever the next 4 years would have been under a second Donald Trump administration, actually looking beyond that. Imagine that the Republicans win 4 years hence. And at that point, because you mentioned about the deep Democratic bench, you wonder what bench there is on the Republican side, and to do things like special envoys to hot zones and stuff like that. Really, they've eviscerated the foreign policy establishment on the right, and you have to go so far back. These are going to be old men and women, if that were to be the case.
Well, I think that's right. In a lot of ways, it's like the post-Watergate era when you sort of wiped out a whole generation of people. In this case, you wiped out a whole generation of people because they either are going to be associated with Trump and therefore won't be seen as viable from the new Republican Party, or maybe the new Republican Party turns out to be the same as the Trump Republican Party, and they continue to block out traditional Republicans. So you saw in President Trump a president who cared more about whether or not somebody had signed a letter against him in the primaries in 2016 than whether they were the best person for the job. And so time and again, he was left in the foreign policy and national security arena looking for people who didn't have the kind of experience that the most senior members of the Republican Party did, looking for people who did not have the stature or the gravitas of the senior Republicans. And so he deprived himself of that kind of talent. Now, it may have saved a lot of people a lot of hassle, because as we saw today with the firing of the defense secretary, you work for President Trump at your own peril. You're not going to leave that experience feeling happy, most likely. So I think that whatever happens in 4 years, whoever is the next Republican president, whenever that might be, it will be a reconstituting of the national security and foreign policy worlds that they have to tap into.
Indeed. Here's a question, a good one for journalists. Baker understood power and how to leverage relationships. Do you think he would have been as effective if starting out now and having to deal with social media and the increased transparency that brings? For the master of media relationships, I'm wondering if Twitter would just be another tool that he'd master, or if he would be tripped up by the populist effect of social media.
Well, and that is actually a great question. I mean, look, that's why the book is, as you said, it's not just the man who ran Washington. It's, when Washington ran the world. This is a portrait of a man and a moment, both of which are definitively, not the present. And Baker obviously is not a populist in any bone in his body. He is the fourth James Addison Baker. He is a huge believer in institutions and stability. He benefited from a media environment that was still controllable in some ways. This was the era of the three national TV networks, and Time and Newsweek and the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. And that was a universe that he could control in some ways. Certainly he could have what he still refers to as message discipline, and in fact, he used that term with us the other day when we were talking with him about, these post-election challenges. And he used that phrase, and it's a very quaint phrase that nobody would use in today's politics. Jim Baker, by the way, doesn't even use email. So never mind Twitter. This guy doesn't even use email. And yet I will say this, he's in fact congenitally wired to succeed. And arguably in some ways his family background hampered him as much as it helped him in politics, right? It was an obstacle in some ways too. And, I do think that He's remarkably good at getting information, given that this is not a man who, betrays any ability to use the internet. He loves to gossip. He's open-minded and curious in the way that, a lot of truly successful people are. He's not insecure. And he's a great reader of people. So I suspect he probably would have figured it out.
I thought he might have been a little insecure at times with George Bush.
Well, that might be an exception. Sure. I think that's fair to say. He's also insecure about his reputation. That he was so concerned to maintain an appearance of rectitude, and the family name weighed heavily on him. But generally speaking,
but confident with you.
And
to be very open, did you feel ever spun? You had a lot of hours of interviews.
Well, of course we were spun. That's what he does. He spins. But the truth is, we were a little wary going in because of his reputation as being, a pretty masterful worker of the press. But we'd always spent 7 years with him at this point. And he opened up to us, I thought, in a way that I don't think he did with anybody else. He gave us all the time in the world we asked for. He gave us complete access to all his archives at Princeton and at Rice University. We interviewed not just the former presidents and vice presidents and secretaries of defense and all that. We interviewed his 8 children, his wife, obviously, his cousin, who was like a brother to him, his nanny, who at age 107 is still around.
Wow.
And I felt like, was he presenting his story? Yes, of course he was. But he wasn't, I didn't feel like he was, in fact, trying to manipulate it at that point. I feel like in the 80s, which is when we were his 80s, when we were getting to know him in this way, he was pretty comfortable with his story. And he knew that it would come out well, warts and all, as he likes to put it. And that broadly speaking, he didn't try to put anything off bounds to us. He never tried once to say we shouldn't write about something or to take issue with anything. Even now, when he's read the book and there are things in there he clearly wouldn't like, he hasn't tried to take issue with us on anything, even though we quote his enemies and his adversaries. And I think that speaks to a certain confidence level in him, that he knows his story overall is a good one.
Thank you. Another question from the field. Did Baker ever make any principled stands that cost him anything? And will you say something about the nature of Jim Baker's personal charm? He clearly was a compelling figure. Why?
The impeachment story.
Yeah, well, Peter has a good story to tell you. Just as far as his personal charm goes, no question about it. He has a natural facility, just a sort of a high emotional intelligence. He was able to read people across class lines or geographical lines. He had been an outsider, in Princeton, but when he was at Princeton, he was, going to New York high society dances that he described and writing home to his parents. And then he spent the summer working literally on an oil rig as a roustabout and covered in black when his mother came to see him. And he carried that into politics very successfully. He had nothing in common with Edward Shevardnadze, the Soviet foreign minister from Soviet Georgia. The two of them, bonded over, vodka in the banya. He would go on to Capitol Hill to negotiate and talk duck hunting with Jesse Helms, and then literally go next door and talk about the opera with Chris Dodd. He had enough genuine ability to talk about both of those things. And we saw that in our own interactions. He had an ability to meet people where they're at.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. In terms of your question on the principle thing, I would tell a story like this. Back last winter, I guess, when we had the impeachment trial here in Washington, President Trump, of course, was on trial for asking a foreign power basically to help him with his domestic politics, right? Well, during the day we covered the trial, and at night we would come home, work on the book. And one night I was looking through some files for the book to make sure we had used all the memos that we correctly fact-checking. I found this memo that we had taken from one of the archives, copied from one of the archives that we had not used in the book and I had forgotten about. And it was really interesting. It was really telling. It was a memo to the file that Jim Baker had written in the 1992 campaign. George Bush was losing to Bill Clinton at the time. And during one day, 4 Republican congressmen show up in the Oval Office and they say to Bush and Baker, you need to go to Russia and get some dirt on Bill Clinton. Because remember Bill Clinton at the time, the question about him protesting against his country while overseas because of Vietnam, and he'd gone to Moscow and maybe he wanted to renounce his citizenship or whatever. And Baker and Bush say, no, we don't go to Russia and ask for help in our domestic politics. That's just, we don't cross that line. And he, of course, because he is good at self-preservation, he writes this down in a memo and he keeps it in a file to make clear that they had said no to this. You could argue about their ethics, but there were lines he just would not cross that today seem to have disappeared.
Yeah, I think the only one he really may have crossed in a way that, you know, it was an election line. He did the Willie Horton ad with Lee Atwater and all of those, but in terms of policy, not so much. A final question. I see Mark on. Mark, if you want to terminate this.
Yeah, we promise people to be on time and we stick with it, but this conversation could go on late at night, and maybe we can pick this up again. There's obviously, I think you said 600 pages, but the stories about politics are really at the center of what a lot of our foreign policy conversation will be going forward. So we will pick this up again. But Peter and Susan, thank you. Thank you for writing this book and the way that you keep us as a nation informed. The media has been in the crosshairs, and we are very, very aware of that. And we want to keep not just supporting media and writers, but saying out loud, our democracy demands the kind of coverage and the kind of intensive questions that you've asked. And Bill, thank you for moderating, but also for keeping our World Affairs Council strong internationally in terms of respect overseas, strong domestically, our organizations. We've got some hills to climb, and we'll have to climb them together, and they'll take leadership and they'll take knowledge and action. And just like that memo that you brought out here right at the very end, there are connections between different times and different periods in our nation's history, and that's the importance of how we report history and how we repeat history. But it's also a never-ending process, and we're going to keep it on. We've had 70 years of this for Global Minnesota, and we're going to have a good next 70, and it seems like we're going to also have a very interesting next 4 years. Speaking of that, 2 hours from now, 9 o'clock tonight, Minnesota Public Radio will be running a portion of our World Food Day program with both Dr. Jeffrey Sachs and Governor David Beasley, who is the Executive Director of the World Food Program. He was our opening speaker just a couple days after the food program received the Nobel Peace Prize. I think people will find how they view the world situation that we face now very interesting, and then how they look forward. So that's tonight. It's a replay from today at noon, so catch that if you'd like, and it's also, of course, archived. And then next Wednesday night, we'll be looking at the contribution of Mexican immigrants in the Minnesota economy. It's a very big part of our economy. It's a very important topic, and 6 o'clock, same time at night, back here on Zoom. It's part of our great conversation series, and look forward to welcoming all of our members and all the other people who are watching tonight, part of the program. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your devotions to our global affairs and to keeping our nation strong and our nation connected to the other peoples on the world. Thank you again, Peter and Bill. Good night to everyone. See you next week.